Welcome to the 7th common session of SunoikisisDC Digital Classics 2017. Today we have a new topic, which is prosopography, with Rada Varga from Romania and Gabriel Bodard from London. So this is an intense common session about data concerning person and people. You have the class outline online in GitHub, as you know, with introduction and everything, also practical exercises. And before starting, only a small note, I sent a message in the Google group, and now we have a new page in the wiki for this semester, which is a page for reading list. So the idea is to collect references to bibliography and other sources. So we start with this page and then we will expand it because we have really many things in Sunoikisis in our class outlines. There is a lot, we have many readings. So the idea is to collect all this material. But now we can start with Rada and Gabriel. Rada and Gabriel, thank you for contributing to Sunoikisis. This is the first common session for Rada. Well, Gabriel is contributing a lot. So Rada, welcome and thank you for joining us in Sunoikisis.
Thank you very much, Monica. You can hear me now, right?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So I will start screen sharing now. In the meanwhile, my name is Rada Varga. I am a researcher in Cluj-Napoca at the Babeș-Bolyai University. As it is my first common session, as Monica said, maybe I should introduce myself first. Can you see my screen?
Yes, it works. We can see the slides.
Okay, good, perfectly. So this common session is about prosopography, digital prosopography. As an introduction, we thought about presenting an overview on prosopography, on what it means and what results it is supposed to bring forth. Prosopography, etymologically, comes from the Greek prosopon, which means person, but it has often been used in dramatical context, so theater connected, and it means character or even mask. I sort of like this definition, this etymological definition, because it means that in prosopography we draw characters, which we sort of do. Coming to a more down-to-earth definition, the dictionary definition for prosopography is a study that identifies and relates a group of persons or historical or literary context. Another definition we have selected was offered by Catherine Keats Rowan, one of the important historical prosopographers of the last few decades, in an article from History and Computing from 2000. And she says that prosopography is about what the analysis of the sum of data about many individuals can tell us about the different types of connection between them, and hence about how they operated within and upon the institutions, social, political, legal, economic, intellectual, of their time. So this is prosopography theoretically speaking. First of all, we have to make the difference between prosopography and another science, another auxiliary science, let's say, which deals with people as well, and that is historical demography. Demography deals with the dimensions of a population, life expectancy, fertility, migration phenomena. So historical demography is closer to sociology, and it deals with large groups of people, with populations, even if we are talking about the population of a small rural settlement or the population of a whole continent. Demography doesn't go up to researching each person with that person's connections and personal files, let's say. But often demography and prosopography are intertwined, and we have to relate on both of them in order to have proper results, scientifically proper results. I will give now some examples and some explanations regarding realities of the Roman Empire. The population of the Roman Empire at a given time has been estimated ranging between 50 and 120 million inhabitants. As you can see, the difference is huge. I will tell you from the start that modern bibliography settles somewhere around 80-90 million inhabitants. I repeat this at a given time, so we have a section in time. In the past, there was a tendency to exaggerate a bit the population of the Roman Empire. At some point in the 1880s, a scholar said that Hispania had around 5 or 6 million inhabitants, and he began a vivid controversy and a quite hot debate about this, because people at that time believed that in those prosperous and somehow peaceful and somehow idealized Roman times, the population of Hispania was much, much larger. But probably this scholar was right, because Philip II Spain had 7-8 million inhabitants. How do we calculate, how do we approximate the population of a territory during a certain historical period? One method, well, there are many methods, but I will only talk about 2 of them which have been proven to have valid results. One method is concerned with density. So you approximate the density of population from a given area and you say how many inhabitants there were. This works quite well for smaller regions, because you have to know very clearly which were the realities of inhabiting that area, the architectural habits, let's say. So it's not the same thing if you have 1-floor houses or if you have 10-storied buildings. Of course, I'm exaggerating with 10-storied buildings. You didn't have that in the Roman Empire. And it's not the same if you have normal houses or if you have normal houses in which a nuclear family lives, or if you have huge houses in which a large number of people live, in which different generations of the same family live. Bottom line, in order to approximate the population of a territory based on density, you have to know the realities of that given territory in the period you are concerned with, because this changes a lot, of course, in time. Another possibility to approximate the population of the Roman Empire is based, which works on a larger scale, is based on a comparison with the population of pre-industrial Europe. So, before the Industrial Revolution, we have censuses, we have documents from late medieval times up until that point, so up until modern days. And we know that the population hasn't oscillated so much. After the Industrial Revolution, the living conditions improved, medicine evolved quickly, vaccination, large-scale vaccination became a habit, and this was the demographic revolution. It is known as the demographic revolution, and it was the beginning of an evolution which led to the demographic realities we know today. So the mortality is decreased, and the life expectancy is dramatically increased compared to other historical periods. This is a very good possibility, and this is a very good analogy for estimating the population of the Roman Empire, of certain Roman regions. Of course, mutatis mutandis, we don't have to forget that we are dealing with a different period of time, with different realities of urbanization, etc. Good. These data are historical demography data. Of course, we know a figure, 18 million inhabitants or 80 million inhabitants. It doesn't matter. We cannot do prosopographical research on that. For prosopography, we need more precise sources. And the sources we can employ are practically exclusive written sources. Archaeology offers through osteology, through paleopathology, offers data on the living conditions, on the health, on the everyday life of a person or a group of people. But this is not prosopography per se. And of course, we can basically never connect a skeleton which offers anthropological and pathological data with a name and a biography for the Roman times. So for undertaking prosopographical research, we need written sources, literary and epigraphic. By literary, I mean everything from poetry, novels, law sources, etc. The literary sources usually offer data and information about the elites, as it is normal. Speaking of real persons, we can have a prosopography of literary characters as well, but that's a different discussion. We are dealing through literary sources, we are dealing with the elite. I don't necessarily mean the power elite of the empire, but with some elitary strata. Epigraphy, on the other side, offers information on the middle classes as well, and on the low middle classes. Of course, on about the lowest social and economical, especially economical classes of the Roman Empire, we don't have direct written sources. We have to deal with that as it is. Now, how many people expressed themselves epigraphically in the Roman world? In the 1980s, but I don't think the results are altered today, so it doesn't matter that the research is a bit older. Josef Hermann did some research on the inscriptions of Gaul, so we are dealing with this area. And he got to the conclusion that from the population, from all the people who lived in Gaul during the Roman period, 0.5 expressed themselves epigraphically. And out of this 0.5, we know today 0.02 people, because the inscriptions were destroyed over time, they haven't been found, and most of them will never be found because they don't exist anymore. I have tried to redo his research process and his calculations for Dacia, so this area, and the results are more or less the same. I got to the conclusion that around 0.2 from the population of Dacia express, we have attested today 0.2, approximately 0.2 from the population of the province. The figure is slightly...
Sorry, Rada, that's 0.2 of 1%. Is that what you're saying?
No, 0.2 from the people who ever lived in the province.
So 1/5. 1/5 of the people, or 1/5 of 1% of the people?
1/5 of 1%.
Right, right. That's what I thought. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So this percent is a bit higher than the one I gave you for Gaul. It might be difference. There might be differences in the system of calculation, but according to Greg Wolf's studies, Dacia had a slightly greater epigraphic representativeness because it is a rather small area. It was a province for a short period of time during the peak of the empire. It was militarized and quite rich. This doesn't matter so much. What's important in the context of this discussion is the fact that we have to be very aware of the idea that we have attested by name and with other certain data much below 1% of the population of the Roman provinces. So this is the sample we are working with, either we like it or not. But this is a small sample compared to the population of the empire, to the population which ever lived in this huge space. In figures, in absolute figures, these are hundreds of thousands of people, of course. but because they represent a small sample and because it is valuable information, it is very important to obtain everything we can from it, as much as we can. And this is how and why the digital tools and methods are very proper, let's say, for ancient prosopography, because structuring the data in a good manner can get you to more results, of course. Having the possibility to do record linkage can give you results which otherwise would be unattainable. And being able to query the data properly, again, is a great advantage. Okay, and I think this is the introduction, which takes us to the structuring person records, which Gabby will present.
Great, thank you very much, Rada. Yes, so let me share my screen, which will give you the same slides. Okay, can you see the same structuring person record slide now?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Great, thanks. So yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about how person records are structured, both traditionally and in digital prosopographies. This is particularly important to think about for the very reason that Rada just explained, that because we have such fragmentary information from the past, we only have information about something like 1 in 5,000 people or even smaller proportion that might have existed in any given period. And we have a very small amount of information about each person, even the ones that we do know about, and even the elites, we know a small amount about their lives. Non-elites, we know just about what happens in the one source that we're given. So very often that source is a gravestone. So we know the date they died and possibly who commemorated them and how old they were and where they were buried, but that's about it. So how we structure that data and how we link this data to other things, as Rada said, to get as much information out of it as possible, both in the particular case and in terms of linking it for scale, to get demographic and other kinds of information, is very important. So I'm going to talk about a few different models for modeling person data or prosopography, which are not quite the same thing. Not all person data is prosopography. All prosopography is about persons, but we won't dwell too much on that distinction. And so I'll talk very quickly about 5 ways of encoding person data. The first being some examples of classic prosopography, print examples. I'll talk a little bit about one of the most popular models for digital capture of prosopography, which is the factoid model. I'll talk a little bit about how we encode prosopography using XML, using the TEI personography module. One of the most common ways you'll come across prosopographical data in a simple form will be an export from a database, which can be presented either in something that looks very much like a spreadsheet or as a comma-separated values file. And I'll talk very briefly about the Snapdragon data model for linking prosopographical data and person data across data sets. So the first of these, to talk about classic prosopography. This is, if you're a classicist and you've done any prosopography or any research into Roman historical persons, you will almost certainly be familiar with the PIR, the Prosopografia Imperii Romani, which is the prosopography of elites in the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries of the Roman Empire. And each person record for, let's say, a person about whom we do know a bit, more than just their name, but who's not one of the very famous elites like one of the Caesars, will look something like this. This is person number 100, Rossius Regulus, and we know a few things about this person. You can see that the PIR gives us basic curriculum vitae, basically, for this person, written in prose, in Latin, of course, because this is a serious German project, and it gives us some dates where they know them. It gives us the sources in very abbreviated form, Tacitus History 37.2 in this case, and a few lines of quotation that tell us, what we know about this person and how we know it. If this is a slightly more well-known person, we might also know some family members and various other kinds of information that we can link to. This is the print PIR. There is, as we'll discuss a little bit more later, also an online version of the PIR, but the online version is basically just a search interface for the print version. So you can look for Rossius regulus, and you can find out that he is person number R100, as in this search result here. This is what you get among the results, the 30 results you get if you search for Rossius regulus. You find that he is PIR second edition R100, and to get any more information about him, you have to go and look it up in the book. In the book, you get what I showed in this screenshot. So it's very useful as a reference source, but it doesn't give us any of the data. Certainly, you can't narrow it down to say, show me people called Regulus only from the 1st century or anything like that. It doesn't have that sort of functionality, which would of course be very useful. Partly because if you look at the plain text of the PIR entry here, all they have in the raw data in PIR is that plain text, and those dates in there, 69, for example, is just a string of text. It's just a piece of text, just the same as 99 is a piece of text, just the same as 37 is a piece of text, just the same as 39 is a piece of text later on, and so forth. Those are, there's no obvious way to tell which of those is a date and which is not. Well, you could do a certain amount of named entity recognition on that, but it's going to be fairly hard to incorporate that in, because it's not structured. It's not structured data. Moving on to a slightly later example, later both in historical and in publication, there's a Christian prosopography, the Prosopography chrétienne du Bas Empire, that has a very similar, as you'll see here, description of a person. The prose is slightly longer. It's also in French, which is a modern language, which is slightly more up to date than Latin. It has the date up here in the top of the record, so that is structured data that has been pulled out and therefore could be extracted and searched by. I mean, this is not a digital resource, but if it were, you could see it would be more structured, and there'd be more you could do with the data. And the references are in footnotes at the bottom. That again makes it slightly more searchable and more structured, and you could do more with that data if you had. You'd still have to find some way to parse what Paplat 34 and Tieda P100 Linear 82 mean equals Marini 119. I have no idea, which of those are authors, which of those are short titles, etc. But we could. That's the sort of thing that could be extracted from it. So that's a slightly more structured, although still primarily prose, prosopographical record. And the third example of a person database that I want to look at just briefly is the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names. This is a person database, although it calls itself a name database, you notice, but it is not a prosopography. It doesn't quite have enough biographical information about individual persons to qualify as a prosopography in the strict sense, although it does disambiguate persons, which is one of the most important things. It's not just a list of, in this case, instances of the name Zenon. If the same person Zenon is referenced 6 times, they are grouped together under a single heading. So it does identify persons. So it is, in a sense, it's person data, not just name data. But as you see here, there's much less information. There's no prose description of this person or of their titulature and curriculum, but it does include people of all social and economic classes that we happen to know about. And it gives the data in a slightly more structured way. It's maybe hard to see here that this is structured data when we have a reference like, Zenon number 2, Inc. Unp Reynolds 1426 brackets Zenon. That may not look a lot more structured, but if you look at The digital version, this in this case gives you slightly more. This is exactly the same information, Xenon 2 there on the second line. This is exactly the same information as in the print version, but it's separated into headings. So you can see there is the publication identifier, number 2 in this case, the name, the sex, place of that the person was associated with, Floret date if we know it, and various other information under references, usually in terms of publications. And this person is in fact unpublished, but the inscription in which this person is attested is unpublished. So that information is there, and it is structured information. So it doesn't have any of the biographical, prosopographical information, but it does have the structured data, which is really useful for searching. So in this, you could say, just show me people called Xenon from the 2nd century BC, and you could filter the information that way. So that's one way of doing it. And then the lexicography person names is although it is in digital form, it is a traditional publication. The first volume of which came out in, I think, 1972. So it's been running, since before, certainly long before the web. So to move on to the one of the most popular models for encoding prosopographical information in a database form. This is the factoid models, which has been talked about quite a lot by John Bradley and others, originally at the King's College London Digital Humanities Department, and several projects have demonstrated and prototyped this model. The idea behind the factoid model is that the foundation of all prosopographical statements are the statements about persons and the sources of those statements. And they wanted to make clear that these statements are not necessarily facts about a person, because some of them may be contradictory with one another. One source may say that a person was born in Lancaster, another source may say that the same person was born in, I don't know, Canterbury, and the two statements will be presented side by side. There may, of course, be commentary saying that the editor believes one over the other, but the incorrect source is not left out. So these are not facts; they're factoids. Was the idea? That's a slightly different meaning of factoid than factoid has come to have in the media. But the idea is that the statements and sources about people are at the root of this model, and therefore that a person record is made up of a series of claims made about that person in our sources, and this enables us to browse and filter on the prosopographical record by many different criteria, because each source and each type of source may refer to many different people. So if a source describes a wedding happening, that wedding will have at least two, usually at least three people involved in it, and sometimes many more. They will name the bride and the groom. They'll also name the person officiating. They may name some of the witnesses. They may name family who are there, and so forth. And this source, therefore, this statement will be a factoid applying to several different person records, which enables us to move sideways, and it builds up this network of relationships that Rada already mentioned, from the very start, from the very root of the data. This sort of model obviously requires a lot of normalization of data, because you need to be able to say that this factoid is a factoid type wedding, and this factoid is a factoid type battle, and this factoid is a factoid type coronation or whatever. And so you need vocabularies to enable this sort of cross-referencing between statements, and between sources, and between persons, and between places, and between other kinds of information, events, and so forth that are referenced in it. So just for a couple of examples of this, the prosopography of the Byzantine world is one of the best examples of a prosopography using the factoid model. This is a person in the prosopography of the Byzantine world. This is Leon 103 is the short identifier for this person. You see, this person is given a name, but every other piece of information about this person, there's also a date. This up here, LXIE, XII, are I think that means late 11th century to early 12th century. That's fairly structured date information, but all of the other information about the person is given as sources. So under narrative, there's various sources that tell us things about this person. Under dignities and offices, each dignity or office that we're given has a reference to where we know about that. So we know that he was Catepano from seal number 1688 in this case. And so the display really reflects this fact that sources are at the heart of all of these person records. And this is just another example of the same thing from the Prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England, another of the real flagship factoid prosopographies, where we have a person whose recorded name has two variant spellings, and we're given the bibliography for each of those variant spellings as core part of the data. So even basic information like name is never given to a person without telling us where we got that information from. Moving on to a very different way of representing prosopographical information or person information. The TEI, the Text Encoding Initiative, which we talked about a few weeks ago already as a text encoding standard, came up a few years ago with a module for recording names and persons in particular. And they decided against calling it the prosopography module for two reasons. One being that nobody other than a prosopographer knows what prosopography means. And the second being that this might not really be about prosopography. This is about recording person data, but not really about recording prosopographical data. I think it can record prosopographical data, but it wasn't originally designed for it. So they called it personography, which I think was possibly a slightly paradoxical attempt to solve the fact that no one knew what prosopography was by inventing a completely new word that people know even less what it was. But that's beside the point. So some of the elements, on this slide shows some of the elements that were created in order to capture information about persons. So such as affiliation, age, birth, etc., country, all of these kinds of information that can be attached to a person. And so here's an example of a very simple person record. The person has a personal name, they have a residence, which is made up of a place name, and they have a florowit date, which can be separated into its, the minimum and maximum range of that date in there. And, they can have a florowit date, or they could have a birth and death date. They could have various other kinds of dates attached to them as well. To go to a classic example, here's from a prosopography of Roman soldiers that some students of mine were putting together in TEI a couple of years ago. We see a slightly longer version of a person record, and in case this is hard to see on the YouTube video, I've got a zoomed in slide of just the first half of that. Here. So we have a person tag wrapping around the whole thing. We have a person name tag, a florowit tag, an affiliation tag, which refers to the place the person is associated with. We have the occupation tag, which can be repeated multiple times, any kind of information. And then the second half of the same person record has some bibliography, where this person is attested. Note that this doesn't break down which pieces of information are attested in which piece of bibliography. So this is not this would be inadequate for representing factoid person prosopography, but it gives us the basic information about the person, and then some other identifiers that this person is known by. This person is, as well as being in this prosopography of Roman soldiers, it's also in PIR and is also in Wikipedia and Wikidata. So all this sort of information is very useful for helping us to link prosopographies together. And then a final example of how relationships are represented in the TEI value. We say that person, in this case, person 304 is the slave of person 307, and so are the next two people. And we can then say that person 307 is the master of those three persons, or master of or owner of, depending on how you want to represent that. Whipping through the last couple of examples. This sort of information can also be represented simply in a table. I mean, if this information were in a database, it might look something like this. where there's a column for name, a column for the beginning of their flora, for the end of their flora, for their affiliation, occupation, bibliography, if they have a PIR number, if they have a Wikidata number, etc. All the same sort of information you've just seen in the TI version or in some of the other versions. Can be represented in a simple table like this, and if that table were represented as a spreadsheet, this is what it would look like. And if this table were represented as comma-separated values, it would look more like this. It would have each line of the text would be a person, and each piece of data would be separated from another by commas. The top line would tell us the headings of those pieces of data, and any of those pieces of data that had commas within them, such as tribunus, comma, quaestor, which are two occupations of the same person, would have quotation marks around them to show that those were not moving on to separate columns in the table. And this can be useful for if you're wanting to query this data outside of the context of a database, which is why I show you that. And the final example I will show you, and I'll whip through this very quickly because I'm going to talk more about this project a little bit later, is the Standards for Networking Ancient Prosopographies project, SNAP, or Snapdragon, which also encodes not full prosopographical data, but encodes a subset of prosopographical data for interchange between prosopographies. So it's a subset of data which is going to be useful for disambiguating whether a person called Eurydica in one prosopography might be the same as a person called Eurydica in another prosopography, by narrowing down via not just her name, but also her date, her place of association, her textual attestations, and relationships with other persons that are known. And so this is the list of the kinds of data that that SNAP records. The very minimum it records is the identifiers for the person, and there's things like name, attestation, disambiguation information, which is place and date and so forth, relationships and other identifiers, as we've shown above, can be very important for separating a person. I'll just flag the fact that this is scenario 2 out of 5 different things that the Snapdragon project recommends how to do, and we'll come back to what the other 4 are a little bit later, and why that's relevant. But this is just an example of those pieces of information from that list with Eurydica, our same example there, recorded in that. And if you go to the slides on Google Slides, which we've given you the link to, you can click on those references. You can click on the Snap identifier to take you to the Snapdragon page. You can click on the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names identifier to take you to the right page there. You can click on the place to take you to Pleiades, and you can click on Aristarchus to take you to the LGPN record for that person as well. And I think now I'll hand you back over to Rada to talk about querying person records. And so her person records are in a database of the kind that I showed can be represented as a table. Rada, over to you.
Okay. Yes. So I am going to present a very specific kind of querying person records. Of course, this can be done in many ways, and there are, as Gabby already presented partially, there are many resources online in which someone can look for certain person records. I'm going to present how we can query a person in this database called Romans 1 by 1. It was built as a population database, so not an epigraphic database, but based exclusively at this time on information offered by epigraphies. So we do not have literary entrances, literary sources as entrances. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not in the database, actually, it's just a picture, okay. We have tried to create personal files for each person attested epigraphically, and we have tried to make these personal files accommodate all kinds of informations from the Greek and Latin epigraphy as well. This is more or less how a person record looks. Initially, the project was focused and still is focused on the lower Danube provinces, with lower Moesia as the easternmost point, and this was the province which had a Greek epigraphic background. In the meantime, the project was developed towards various directions through individual projects. And one of them is centered around the associations from the shore of Asia Minor. I think it's a PhD project. So at this point, we have in the database, I believe, about 50-50 persons from Greek and persons from Latin inscriptions. I'm just showing you the personal files a little as I talk. Our first data sets will be online in April probably, and then we will keep putting data sets online as we get to cleanse them, because after the data entry, the cleansing process is very, very time consuming, and we have to be very careful, of course. Of course, the online interface will be much more user-friendly than sorry, what I will show you now. Here it might seem a bit difficult to query a person because we have to jump from one table to the other all the time. But on the other side, you can see the structure better than it will be visible online, because online you won't be able to see all the tables. Technically speaking, it's a relational database. I don't think I've mentioned this before. So I decided to show you how it works through an example, through a rather complex example, because we don't have so much information in all the cases, obviously. Let's say we stumble upon this inscription in a database, in the Heidelberg epigraphic database in this case. It is an inscription from Salona, which says that Aurelius Aquila, a decurio Patavicensis, a merchant from province Dacia, dedicates the monument to his wife, Valeria Ursina, daughter of Titus, with whom he had lived 7 years without a single fight, he says. And maybe from one reason or the other, we are curious to know if there are more information about these people attested somewhere. And we are going to the personal data table and search filters. We have search filters, and we will have them online as well for everything and anything we could imagine. No, not we could imagine, but that was found in inscriptions. And let's say the personal name is the easiest way to query. Aquila. We have more Aquilas, of course, it's not a rare name, but it's only one Aurelius Aquila. And we are opening his personal file. Now, here you can see all the fields, even the ones which we don't have data for. Online, of course, they won't be visible, and it will be easier because you will only be able to see the fields with information. So what do we have here? He comes from province Dacia, of course. He is a merchant. We sort of knew these things from the inscription, but here is the interesting part. He is the husband of Valeria Ursina, which we knew, and the friend of 2 men, and the father of a Titus Aurelius Apollonius. So he is attested in other inscriptions as well. And we can see here the inscriptions. There are 2 attestations of the man. In order to look for the inscriptions, we have to go to the inscriptions table and look for the inscription code. These inscription codes will be links, of course. And here we are looking for the inscription. This is the first inscription. We can realize at this point that this is our inscription because its funerary is from Dalmatia, and it has this atypical feature, double D's and double M's. But maybe if we are not careful enough and we haven't seen this, we can just click on the link and we see, yes, this is the inscription we already know. So we are going back, and it means that all the other information come from this inscription from the second listed one. And this is as well a funerary inscription, as well from Solin. And we can go on the link to see the whole inscription. The point is that these files are personal files. The database was not meant to recollect the texts of the inscriptions, which are available on many databases. So we've decided to put links for whoever wants to check the text to find out more data, but not to rewrite the text of the inscription. Here we know, I will shortly tell you what it tells. So this Aurelius Aquila dedicates this monument for Titus Aurelius Apollonius, his son, and for two other men which he calls friends, Aurelius Flavus, merchant, Syrian merchant, and Aurelius Lucianus, about whom we don't know anything else anymore. Now, we are probably curious to find out more about these persons. At this point, we can only do it like this. So we are re-going to the personal data table and to the search filters. And let's look for the son, Apollonius. There are more as well, but it's only one, Titus Aurelius Apollonius. And what do we find about him? So his only relationships are the mother and father. We can safely say that Valeria Ursina was his mother and not a different wife of the father, as her father's name was Titus as well. And here we have something else I wanted to show you. So we have the age, he died in Sirmius, it's written on the inscription. And the inscription also says that he is a centurio, so a centurion in a cohors prima miliaria. But it doesn't give any other details. Here in the observation field, we have that maybe it is the cohors prima miliaria of the Legio Secunda di Utrix from Agvincum. This is the closest, geographically speaking. But this is an editor's note. This is not something we know from the inscription for sure. He could have been a centurio in a cohorts, in a legionary cohorts miliaria anywhere in the world, in the empire basically, or he could have been a centurio of an auxiliary cohorts, of course. The thing is that the editor's notes, which the users can believe or not, can check, recheck, whatever, are always listed in observations field. So there is a clear difference between what is a note and what is known for sure from the monument, from the epigraphic monument. Okay, he's attested only in this inscription. Okay, you will have to believe me that Aurelius Lucianus is not attested anywhere else. I don't think it's a point in looking for all of them. But let's look for Aurelius Flavus, because Aurelius Flavus, it's not a common name because the Flavius form is actually common. And we have here again an interesting case. We can see that we have more information on him. He is Syrian, as I said. He's a merchant. He died in Sirmius at the age of 55, but he also dedicates at some point to Jupiter Optimus Maximus Dolihenus. So obviously he is attested somewhere else as well. And we can see at the attestations that yes, we have two inscriptions, and he is an amicus of Aurelius Aquila, which we know, and a co-worker or associate of a certain Aurelius Alexander. So we know that this information must be from the other inscription. It is clear enough that the second inscription is the one we've already seen because it comes from Dalmatia, and it was from Dalmatia. This one is from Dacia, and we will look for it. As I already told you, we have to go back to the tables all the time. because in this working form, of course, we didn't put any links. It would have only made it harder. And we see that this is a votive monument. We could have expected that because we had a deity from Apulum. And let's see it here. It's actually a Dolyhanian column, quite nice. And is dedicated by Aurelius Alexander and Aurelius Flavus, Syrian merchants. They both denominate themselves as Syrian merchants. Good. Now, through structuring the data and being able to do this record linkage, we have got to a point where we have not only some random inscriptions, which basically don't say so much, or they do, but it's really not a lot of information, and especially prosopographically, it's not a lot of information. We have got from this point to this point, where we can actually reconstruct a little personal network. It's a social, professional, and familial network. As you can see, we have Aurelius Aquila with his family, his wife and their son, his two friends, and the associate or whatever of Aurelius Flavus. This, in the context of prosopography, this is very relevant because it tells us a lot about, not only about the mobility of merchants, about how these men kept their relations as they moved into a different province. It is, whoa, sorry. So it is definitely a step forward, and it is only possible by what we are saying in the previous sections of the presentation, by structuring the data, but by querying it and by putting it into a form which allows you to undertake more elaborate research. Okay, I think that now we get to prosopography at scale. Gabby?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I'll whip through these slides. I want to talk about three projects. Well, 3 projects and a method, if you like, to talk about what we can do at scale once we have this sort of prosopographical and other maybe not strictly speaking prosopographical person data in large amounts. And this basically amounts to making connections between persons and other kinds of data, and connections between projects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about VIAF, which is it's a library catalog. It's not a prosopography. I'm going to talk about Trismegistos people, which is something that starts from a study of names rather than prosopographical study. Talk a little bit about social network analysis, which is a method that the Trismegistos people have pioneered to some degree, and I'll end up by talking very, very briefly about a little bit more about the Snapdragon project, which aims to link together multiple prosopographies and disambiguate person references between them to create a sort of giant virtual authority table of persons from the ancient and other historical worlds. So to start with, so VIAF, as I've said, is basically it's a library catalog. It's the virtual international authority file, and what it's done, it's created by combining together the name authority files from many contributing library catalogs. And name authority files in library catalogs tend to be made up of 2 kinds of people. One is authors, so people that need to be disambiguated because there may be multiple people called John Smith who have authored books, and the library catalog needs to know which one is which, especially if some of them have written several books, or even if only one book, but it's held in several libraries. The other category of person is people about whom books are written. So Alexander the Great never wrote a book, but Alexander the Great is in library catalog person authority files as someone who needs to be disambiguated, because there are many other people called Alexander, some of whom people have written books about, some of whom have written books. And not only books, but also people who have are represented in art, people who are creators of other kinds of data that libraries and other catalogs refer to. So, sculptors, playwrights, filmmakers, whatever. So this, as it turns out, once you link together the many library catalogs like this, you end up with a massive data set of millions and millions of persons. And it's very, very useful for disambiguating. It has no prosopographical information in. Very occasionally it will have date information, very occasionally it will have multiple names for a person, but it'll almost never say anything about the person's, curriculum vitae or titles they held or whatever. So moving on to Trismegistos people, as I said, this doesn't quite call itself a prosopography because it doesn't fully disambiguate person data, and also it doesn't contain the sort of narrative biographical information about persons that a full prosopography would, but it is raw data for prosopographical work. In that it does aim to disambiguate and identify co-references to the same person in multiple texts, and so it is the essential starting point for any kind of prosopographical research on this sort of data. And so to show how this works, you can see the relationship between the number of references. The core data type in Trismegistos people is references to people in ancient texts, mostly papyri, because it focuses on Egypt. So there are 500 references to people. So a person reference is any one text with each person that is named in it. So if one text names 6 different people and one of those people may be named twice, that is 7 person references. Okay. Now, of those 500,000 or so person references, they have disambiguated them to being only about 1/3 people. So a certain number of those, 130,000 of those, also have been identified as people who are already known from another text, and so you don't need 2 separate person records for them. So 2 person reference records are merged into a single person record in that step. And the third step, there are only 33,000 individual names because a lot of people, of course, have the same name. And that doesn't mean they're the same person, but it means that the onomastic information about that particular name doesn't need to be repeated 10 or 12 times per name. So there's a much smaller database of names in there. So that relationship between references and people and names really gives you a sense of the structure of the Trismegistos people database. And so one of the things that the Trismegistos database has enabled them to do is do a lot of work in social network analysis. And I'm talking now in general terms about social network analysis, not specifically about Trismegistos' use of social network analysis. And I started this slide with a link to one of the Sunoikisis Digital Classics sessions from last semester, where Greg Wolf and Silke van Besselara talked about social network analysis, because they had a whole hour in which to talk about this, and I'm going to try and talk about it in about 1.5 minutes. So if you want to know a little bit more, or anything at all really about what this means, go watch that video instead, because you will actually learn something and it'll be very useful. What social network analysis is basically is visualization of relations between people. I mean, network analysis can also be used to visualize other kinds of relationships between other kinds of data, but for social network analysis, we're primarily talking about relations between people. And so those relations can be family relations, or they can also be relations based on co-appearance in documents. For example, that imaginary document I talked about a minute ago that had 7 person references in, those 7 people have some kind of a relationship between them just by virtue of appearing in the same document. And so you can start to build a network based on people who appear in the same documents as other people. And they may appear in the same documents as other people multiple times. And then what's the indirect relationship between a person who appears in the same document as me and a person who appears in the same document as that person, and so forth. This visualization then leads to our being much more able to see patterns in the data than we might otherwise see. But it's worth noting that social network analysis it's a sociological data method, and to do very detailed statistical work with social network analysis really requires complete data sets. So the sorts of techniques that are conventionally used in network analysis that work very well with very complete data sets, such as modern medical records or collections of correspondence or related similar things, are much more risky when performed on data of the level of fragmentary data of the kind that we see from the ancient world. Social network analysis is often said is very good at helping to pose questions rather than necessarily having the answers to those questions. But if you see something interesting in your visualization of these relationships, you can sometimes look more closely at the data and spot something you might not have seen otherwise. So just to give a couple of examples of how social network analysis works, and all of these examples are taken from the guide to social network analysis on the Data Ninja site by Jana Brooks and Silke van Besselare. So again, go and read what they've written about this rather than what I'm about to sort of whip through. But so basically, this slide shows how a social network analysis visualization is structured. Each of those points on this slide is a person, and some of them are different colors for whatever reason. And each of the lines between them is a relationship of one kind or another between those two persons. And this then leads to clusters of persons who all have relationships with one another, but are isolated by having no relationships with persons in the other clusters. Okay, or at least no known relationships in our sources. And some of these clusters have people that all are equally related to one another, and some of these clusters like these have people who are partly related to other people in the cluster, but not related to some other people except indirectly via others. And this shows, a cluster of several clusters of people who are all very tightly related within the clusters, but there's no relationship between the clusters. A different kind of network, visualized in a slightly different way, but you can see that it's the same sort of thing. There are these nodes, which are persons, and there are the lines, the edges between them, which are the relationships between them. In this case, the nodes have been labeled, so you can see the names of the persons involved. And this has used some of the social network analysis algorithms to identify two clusters in slightly different colors that are related to each other, but the relationships within each cluster are much stronger than the relationships between the clusters. And so this can already give you certain kinds of information, or at least ways of looking at and questioning your data in new ways. As these networks get larger and more complex, you can end up with networks like this, where the patterns are maybe more useful than the individual names on them. So seeing that there are two very prominent figures in the middle of this network with lots and lots of peripheral people around them is more useful necessarily than knowing the names of each one of these people around them. And in any case, there's too many visualized on a single screen for you to be able to read the names if they were all given. And as these things get bigger and as they get more ornate, and as the ways of displaying them change and use more colors, you end up with what Brooks and Besselare call more spaghetti monster analysis, where this very beautiful image is now almost entirely meaningless, especially with the sort of fragmentary data that we have from the ancient world. I'm almost certainly misrepresenting this, but as I say, go and read what they have to say about it instead. So just to very quickly finish off by talking again about the Snapdragon project. This is a project which attempts to use, or at least attempts to aggregate data in such a way that it can become big data. So very complex data with very many individual nodes, individual persons, and even more relationships between those persons and those references and those data sets. And so this has, in its first instance, attempted to aggregate, that is to say, bring together and co-reference, that is to say, find when a reference in dataset A is a reference to the same person as another reference in dataset B, so that you can simplify and disambiguate this. Persons from the Lexicon Greek Personal Names, from the Trismegistos people table, from VIAF that we just showed, from PIR that you saw earlier, from the online version, which doesn't have, as I say, all the detailed prosopographical information, and many more data sets. And it produces, for each individual person, a page like the one we see here, and it attempts to link these persons together using these 5 scenarios. Firstly, the prosopographers have to be online. Then we generate person data pages for each person in each data set, as I showed you a little bit earlier. We identify unproblematic co-references between them. So when a person in the lexicon of Greek personal names is named in a particular inscription, and a person in Trismegistos is named in the same inscription, those are unambiguously the same record. They're not just probably the same person, they are unambiguously the same record. Then the fourth one is we make assertions about person. These are scholarly assertions where you think the 2 records, even if you're absolutely sure, it's still a scholarly assertion rather than an unambiguous assertion. And finally, using these identifiers of these disambiguated persons as identifiers for an annotation of texts with person information. And in this sense, the Snapdragon project aims to end up in exactly the same place as the Pelagios project that you saw talked about a few weeks ago, where Pelagios uses place identifiers and Snap uses person identifiers. So that was all I wanted to say about those things. We have a few minutes to talk about the practical exercises, if people think that would be useful. The exercises are on the page anyway, on the class outline. So we can talk about the exercise very briefly, but we don't want to use up all the time that could be used for questions. So on this slide, there's just a few of the links that are mentioned in the class page anyway, and that will be useful in the exercise. But Rada, shall we very quickly talk about the 2 parts of the exercise that we wanted to suggest?
I don't know, maybe very quickly. So
yeah. Yes, you can do that. I think it's important for students and participants. Yes.
Okay, so the first exercise has 2 parts. In the first part, you have an example of a Roman senator, and you have to identify his attestations, his epigraphic attestation, and his PIR link, because he is listed there, and you have to find the other attestations anywhere you can think of. So you are supposed to use the links we have provided. And in the second part of the
so that's both the digital research and traditional research, right? You'll have to both look online and spend some time in the library, because not all the information is in either place.
Yes, after you will look online, you will realize that it's not all the information, and that you have to also do some traditional research indeed. And the second part of the exercise is structured more or less as what I have just presented in the previous section. So you have an inscription, and you are supposed to construct a little prosopography of the dedicator, identifying all the information available in sources. He's not he's not part of the elite. He is more or less normal person, a middle class person. Okay, I think this is it for the first exercise.
Right, and the second exercise then is you now have a set of prosopographical information about 2 persons that you've collected from various places, from various inscriptions and various prosopographies. I mean, you know some things, you know everything there is to know about those 2 persons. What we would like you to do is to try and create a prosopographical record for at least one of those persons. Why not both? Both in the Snapdragon format and using TEI in XML. And you learned how to edit TEI XML a few weeks ago. So taking the example from a few slides ago to mock up a person record for this figure. And the interesting thing to see will be what things can you do in TEI that you can't do in Snapdragon, and what things vice versa, and what things can you do in neither, because neither is intended to be full prosopographical information, as I said. And so what sort of How would you structure these people in Rada's Romans 1x1 database, for example, instead, which is much, much richer in prosopographical information? Maybe you could imagine to yourself how you would structure this person information in a factoid database as another alternative. So play around with all of those possibilities, and we'll see what questions you come up with.
Okay, Gabby, Rada, thank you very much. So do we have questions? We have people in the Hangout and also on YouTube. So if there are no questions, I have questions. So, well, first, thank you very much, because we have many things. And so I think the important, well, this is about prosopography, but of course we have, now we have a problem of collecting and structuring data, in the sense that these databases are fundamental for our work, but we have to collect data. And for example, for inflected languages like Greek and Latin, we need not only the lemma or the nominative for these names, but we also need the inflected forms. So that's the thing. So how to collect data from, I know that because as you know, I'm working with a collection of fragmentary authors. We have fragments with many personal names, not only place names, but we have many personal names. Most of them are unknown, and also in the Digital Atheneus I have this. So I'm collecting this data, I'm extracting these personal names, but of course, and I'm trying to connect this data with, for example, the LGPN and other resources. So forms, I have to lemmatize them to get the lemma, and then from the lemma to try to find these names in these collections. But in these collections, well, in the LGPN we have Greek forms, for example, which is good, but in other cases we don't have the Greek form. We have, for Greek personal names, we have the Latin form based on indices, or modern forms in English or in other languages. For example, in the VIAF we have also, I think, Greek forms, yes, sometimes, but we have many modern forms. So this is just an example. So this is, I think, the first important thing. So basically, the thing is that we have to build these databases, and at the same time we have to work on digitizing collections, and then to contribute. So one side is to build databases because they are important for working with other collections, and then at the same time we have to digitize many sources in order to give data to these collections and databases. So, well, you know this problem, so this is the first big topic. We don't have enough time to talk about that, but I think this is important.
Sure, that's one of the things that Snapdragon was designed to try and address. Both how do we, if we have a person in your Digital Atheneus, for example, who appears in the Lexicon of Greek Personal Names because they have a Greek name, and appears in PIR because they were a Roman elite at the same time, and appears in some other prosopographies, and maybe has an article in Wikipedia. Which one of those do we use to disambiguate? They all have their advantages, but what there isn't is an easy way to map between them. So firstly, creating a way to map between them, using as much as possible sort of big data techniques, and so network analysis techniques and so forth, to try and identify those co-references, so we know whichever one of those you link to doesn't matter, because we can link all of them to each other, and also to provide search information on that. So Lexicon of Greek Personal Names will only have the person's name in Greek. PIR will only have the person's name in Latin, which may or may not be the same name. Trismegistos, if they happen to have this person, will very often give the name, even if the name isn't attested in multiple languages. They will give, because they have a separate table of names, they will very often say that this name in Greek is equivalent to these 3 different spellings in Latin, is equivalent to this Hebrew name, is equivalent to this Egyptian name, and Coptic name, and various other things. So have name information to enable searching across this. And then, as you say, the important thing is what you do with that data, and that's what will give us new prosopographical data, is when people find a new person and they first do a search to say, do we already know this person? And when they don't, then you need to create an annotation and say this is a new person, and you're then creating prosopographical information. And this will become a tool for prosopographical research.
Yes, of course, because when you extract data from a text, you can extract single names, but then you have to express the relationship. That's the difficult thing.
Right.
But it works. For example, I'm doing that for fragments and it works. I'm collecting data. Of course, then we have to find a way to optimize the disambiguation, because of course, every one of us can go there to the text and check, but we have to find a good way for disambiguation. For example, I can get a list of many Greek names, of course, in the LGPN, and then I have to find what I'm looking for. And sometimes, for example, I have names that are both personal names and place names. I don't have an example now, but it happens, and this is interesting because I'm collecting data also from Pleiades. So this is interesting, and disambiguation, as for other things, is another, and we need to work on that. So how, given that we have big data now, so how?
Yes, and when you work on scale, when you work at scale with big data like that, you can't check each one by hand. I mean, obviously, in order to make a safe claim about a person's identification, you do need to be able to check them by hand. But sometimes we're not interested in just making safe, absolutely 100% clear claims. We're talking about making probable and likely claims across millions of person references in large bodies of text. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about named entity extraction. It's exactly this sort of thing where we got text. Even if we only get it right 90% of the time, that's enough for us to be able to do really useful work across a body of data that's unstructured and is far too big for us to be able to do it all by hand. So that's one of the things that having as good training data, it's gold standard data, that's what we're doing by creating prosopographies in onomastica. Enables that sort of work, as well as being a research, important research in its own right, of course.
Yeah. And yes, and then if we can have really a thesaurus where we have the lemma in this case, the name, the nominative, and then all the forms. And then if we include inscriptions and papyri, of course, we have problems concerning the text gaps. Of course, you know that, for example, this is a problem also for true banking, because when we have not completed the names in inscriptions, how can we annotate that? So this is, I'm going beyond prosopography, but we know that our topic, so there are many things related to each other, and so that's why I'm going beyond prosopography. And collecting data definitely is one of the problems we have, or at least one of the interesting challenges we have. And then another thing, well, for virtual international authority file, I can also say that the Perseus catalog is contributing to VIAF. So this is very important because, the Perseus catalog is a big catalog of classical authors, so is officially contributing to VIAF. We need that, so we need to contribute with our data to these sources. And then I have a question for Rada. So for the Romans one by one, so my question is another big question, but so basically you are collecting okay, so information based on epigraphy and archaeology, but so how do you collect data, and how did you structure the database? So the information, for example, if I'm correct, so there are information about, I don't know, the inscription, where the name appears, and then other prosopographical and onomastic information. I don't know the cursus honorum, but how did you, so I imagine there is a lot of work behind the database. So at the beginning of the project, how did you work on that? I know it's a big question, I'm sorry, but this is important, I think, for the audience.
I will screen share to show the database.
Yeah, thank you.
I think it's easier to talk with it in front of us. So at the beginning, we imagined that, as I said, it is a prosopographical database. We are going around the personal files. This is the most important thing in the database. But of course, we need to have the inscription files, because otherwise the information is deeply incomplete. So we have these main tables and of inscriptions, inscription bibliography, because here we have a reference table which can be extracted per se, if you need to use it for anything else, and the personal data file and the relations table, where we have imagined a system which is quite simple, but I think it's efficient enough. So we have person one, relation I don't know what, we have a list of relationships and they are encoded. I forgot to say that in the presentation, I realized it afterwards, that we had these encodings for professions and for relationships. They are for the CSVs, because when you are extracting them and you have a column with the encodings, it's very easy to do any kind of statistics or social network analysis directly. You don't have to work on the data anymore. And for the files, for each file, we have a lot of tables which are drop-down menus, basically, in the personal file. We are working on published information, of course. The inscriptions are available on all the important databases, corpora, and some of them in the which are newer, or I don't know, that we look for them in all the publications that we know of or which are available to us. And I don't know what else.
No, thank you very much. So, of course, this is a big question about structure in database, especially like this one, which is really huge. So this is another thing. So collecting data and structuring data and arranging data. So these are two big things. So thank you for
the structure of the database is completely visible with the guest user I have provided.
Yeah.
So the only thing someone cannot do with that guest user is add entries or delete entries, but you can see the files completely and the relationships between the tables.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, in fact. Okay, thank you. Well, now we are late and it's my fault, I know, so I apologize. I don't know if there are other questions. So no questions. Okay, well, thank you, because this is interesting, and so every time we go beyond our topics, but that's the thing, because that's why we have Sunoikis, we have this syllabus with many different topics, but they are related because we have common problems, common needs, and so I think this is an interesting thing. So, well, now, okay, we have to stop. So next week we have another topic, computational morphology. And so you have everything online, slides are online, practical exercises. So thank you very much again for this dense common session. Thank you, Rada and Gabby. And good night and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, bye.